In the spring of 1981, in a county extension office in Harlan County, Iowa, a soil map hung on the wall behind the agent's desk. It had been there so long that the paper had yellowed at the corners and the tape holding it up had started to peel. Every farmer in the county knew that map the way they knew their own hands. The good ground was shaded dark, rich black prairie loam that grew 150 bushel corn without asking much in return. The average ground was shaded gray. And then in the northwest corner, near the river bluffs, there was a patch shaded almost white. 40 acres, class 6 soil, rocky, thin, steep in places. The kind of ground where a plow blade met limestone before it ever found 6 inches of topsoil. The county extension agent, a man named Arlo Stills, had a name for it. He called it dead ground. Nobody argued with him. That name had been settled for years before Arlo ever pinned up the map, passed down through the memory of every farmer who had ever tried to work those 40 acres and walked away with less than he came with. The last man who tried to farm it, a tenant named Sweeney, gave up after 2 seasons and told the landlord he would rather dig roadside ditches than fight those rocks one more day. After Sweeney left, the ground sat empty. Weeds moved in first. Then cedar trees crept in from the fence rows, slow and patient, the way cedar always is. The county assessor eventually stopped listing it as cropland at all. For all practical purposes, those 40 acres had been erased from the productive map of Harlan County. And then on a cold Thursday morning in March of 1981, a woman named Clara Voss bought it. 40 acres of dead ground, $185 an acre, $7,400 total. Cash. No bank, no loan officer, no signature on a promissory note. Dale Renfrew heard about it that same afternoon. He was at the feed store on the south end of town, leaning against the counter with his coffee, his gold watch catching the fluorescent light halfway through a story about a farmer over in Butler County who had just financed a brand new 4840. When someone mentioned Clara's name and what she had done, Dale stopped mid-sentence. He set his cup down. He looked around at the men in the store, 3 or 4 farmers, the kids stocking shelves behind the counter, a seed rep from out of town, and then he started to laugh, not a polite laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and comes out loud enough to fill a room. Clara Voss, he said, just bought dead ground. He shook his head. A woman alone, and she picks the worst 40 acres in Harlan County. That's not farming. That's just finding a more expensive way to lose. The men laughed. The seed rep smiled. The kid behind the counter looked up. Nobody asked what Clara planned to do with the land. It didn't seem worth asking. But here's the question that matters. Here's the question that the laughter in that feed store never got around to asking. Not what Clara Voss was doing, but why. And whether the men doing the laughing had any idea what was actually happening around them. Because in the spring of 1981, most of them didn't. To understand why Clara Voss bought 40 acres of rock and failure, you have to understand what had been happening in rural Iowa for the past decade. And to understand that you have to go back to the beginning of a story that seemed for a long time like it could only end well. In the 1970s, American agriculture went through what economists would later call the Great Expansion. Export markets opened wide. Grain prices climbed to levels nobody had seen before. Corn hit $3.56 a bushel. Soybeans touched $10. And the land beneath all of it, the flat black prairie ground of Iowa and Illinois and Indiana, doubled in value, then tripled. Between 1970 and 1980, the average price of Iowa farmland rose from $419 an acre to over $2,000. Some of the best ground in the state was trading hands at $3,200. The banks did not sit still through all of this. The Federal Land Bank, the Production Credit Association, the Farmers Home Administration, they were all writing loans like the good times had been written into law. And the men who sold equipment, men like Dale Renfrew, who ran the John Deere dealership out of the metal building on the highway west of town, they watched all of it and felt certain that they were standing at the center of something permanent. In 1979 alone, Dale sold 32 new John Deere tractors. 32. His showroom was always lit. He kept a pot of coffee going from 7 in the morning until 6 at night. Farmers came in with their hats in their hands and their financing already half arranged, and they picked out machines that cost more than their fathers had paid for their first farm. New 4440s at $32,000 apiece, new grain carts, new planters, New combines with air-conditioned cabs and radios, and hydraulic this and electronic that. Dale shook every hand and meant it when he said the world needs to eat and you are the ones feeding it. He believed it. That is important to understand. Dale Renfrew was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had found himself in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. And like most people in that position, he assumed the moment would continue. It did not continue. In October of 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to fight inflation. By 1981, the prime rate had climbed to 21.5%. Farm operating loans that had been written at 9% were renewing at 18%. At the same time, President Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union. Following the invasion of Afghanistan, and export markets collapsed almost overnight. Corn dropped to $2.20. Soybeans fell back below 6. And the land, all that land that farmers had mortgaged themselves to the edge of ruin to own, began to lose value. Not slowly, not gently, the way a stone drops into water. The 1980s farm crisis had begun. Over the next 5 years, more than 300,000 American farms would be lost. In Iowa alone, land values would fall 63% from their 1981 peak. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha would eventually fail, the first federal land bank to fail since the Great Depression. Towns would empty. Rural churches would close their doors. The suicide rate among farmers would climb to 3 times the national average. That was the world Clara Voss walked into when she raised her hand at that auction in March of 1981. She was 44 years old. She had grown up on her father's 200-acre farm outside Harlan, the younger of 2 children, and she had stayed when her older brother Denton had not. Denton had left for Des Moines in the early 70s, drawn by something the farm couldn't offer: a salary that arrived on Fridays, a life that didn't depend on rain. He had not looked back. The phone calls became less frequent. By the time their father died, Denton and the farm had become strangers to each other. Their father was Calhoun Voss. He was a man who farmed with a Farmall M and a 2-bottom plow his entire working life, who measured every decision against a single question: can I pay for this without borrowing? If the answer was no, he didn't do it. When the neighbors were trading in their old equipment for new John Deeres in the 70s, Calhoun kept the Farmall running with spare parts. He machined himself in the workshop behind the barn. When the bank called, and they called more than once offering lines of credit, talking about opportunity, Calhoun thanked them politely and said the same thing every time: I don't owe any man anything, and I intend to die that way. He died in the fall of 1978, debt-free. He left Clara the 200 acres and a workshop full of hand tools and the Farmall M with 11,000 hours on the meter. He left her something else, too, something that couldn't be written in a will. He left her the habit of watching carefully before acting, the habit of measuring what things actually cost, not just what they were priced at. The night before the auction, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the county land survey spread out in front of her and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She had been looking at that white patch in the northwest corner for weeks, not because she thought it was good ground. She knew it wasn't good ground. Arlo Stills had told anyone who had listened for years that it was dead ground, and the soil samples backed him up. Thin topsoil, heavy clay underneath, high pH from all the limestone, organic matter barely above 1%, the kind of numbers that made an agronomist wince. The phone rang. It was Denton calling from Des Moines. He had heard through the family grapevine that Clara was thinking about the Brandt estate auction. Clara, he said, tell me you're not going to do something foolish. She didn't say much in response. She told him she was thinking it through. He told her that 40 acres of rock on a hillside was not an investment, it was a charity donation to the limestone industry. He told her she was a woman farming alone, and she didn't need another problem. He told her that if she had money sitting around, she should keep it sitting around, because the way things were going, she might need it. She listened until he was finished. Then she said goodnight and set the phone back in the cradle. She poured the cold coffee down the drain and made a fresh cup and sat back down with the map. What Denton could not see from Des Moines, what almost nobody in Harlan County could see from inside the decade they had just lived through, was that Clara had not been idle during the boom years. She had been watching, and she had been saving. $600 a month every month into a savings account at the Jessup State Bank. Not because she was afraid, not because she was too cautious to act, But because she had seen something in the numbers that the men signing loan papers in the late 70s had not wanted to see. She had watched interest rates begin to creep upward. In 1977, had listened to economists on the radio talk about inflation in ways that made her uneasy, had noticed that the land prices being quoted at auctions had started to disconnect from anything a farm could actually earn in a good year. She had run the math herself sitting at the same kitchen table, and the math did not work. It hadn't worked for years. It just hadn't stopped working loudly enough for most people to hear yet. By March of 1981, she had $47,000 in that account, and she had been thinking about those 40 acres for 3 weeks. This is the part that the laughter in the feed store missed entirely. Clara wasn't buying dead ground because she didn't know it was bad. She was buying it because she understood something about it that nobody else had stopped to consider. For 100 years, every farmer who had touched those 40 acres had tried to make it into something it wasn't. They had plowed it. They had planted corn on slopes that were never meant to be cultivated. They had pushed heavy machinery across ground that broke equipment and resisted every input thrown at it. And every year, what little topsoil existed had washed down the hillsides and into the creek that ran along the south edge of the property. By 1981, those 40 acres had maybe 3 inches of topsoil on the flat spots and almost nothing on the slopes. The subsoil was heavy clay mixed with limestone fragments. The pH sat at 7.8. Organic matter at 1.2%. For comparison, good Iowa prairie soil carried organic matter between 5 and 6%. Dead ground had been farmed until it was dead and then abandoned to confirm the diagnosis. But here was what Clara saw when she looked at that white patch on the map. She saw the only 40 acres in Harlan County that had not been pushed to the edge of its productive capacity by a decade of maximum extraction. The good ground, the dark shaded acres that had sold at $3,200 an acre had been pushed hard through the 70s. Maximum fertilizer inputs, maximum corn density, minimum rotation, minimum rest. The farmers who owned that ground had borrowed against its value and planted it as hard as they could to service the debt, and in doing so they had quietly been drawing down the biological reserves that made it valuable in the first place. Nobody talked about that. The soil tests still looked acceptable. The yields were still coming in, but the ground was being mined. The dead ground had been spared that particular fate because it was too difficult to mine. You cannot extract something from a place that wouldn't let you in. And so by accident, those 40 acres had been left alone long enough that something might still be possible there. Not corn, not soybeans, not anything the market would pay for in the short term, but something. Clara raised her hand at that auction after the auctioneer had asked 3 times and the room had gone quiet. She paid $185 an acre, $7,400 total, cash. She drove home on gravel roads with the bill of sale on the passenger seat and the radio off and the windows cracked against the cold. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter than that. She felt the particular satisfaction of a decision made carefully over a long time finally put into motion. The auction was on a Thursday. By the following Monday, she was walking the land. She carried 2 things with her. A notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that cost less than $1 at the hardware store, and a soil probe that her father had made in the workshop 30 years earlier. It was a simple tool, a T-handled steel tube, hand-forged, worn smooth where his palms had gripped it thousands of times. She had kept it hanging on the workshop wall since 1978. She had not used it yet. She used it now. She spent 5 days walking those 40 acres before she did anything else. 5 days of slow, careful movement across ground that pushed back against every step. The slopes were steeper than they looked from the road. The limestone came up through the soil in places like old bones. The cedar trees along the fence rows had sent their roots out 6 feet in every direction, claiming what ground they could. Down near the creek, the banks had eroded until the water ran brown after every rain, carrying topsoil that had been migrating downhill for decades. She took soil samples from 47 different points across the property. She noted where the limestone was closest to the surface, where the clay ran deepest, where rainwater would pool, and where it would shed. She noted which slopes faced south and would warm early in the spring, and which faced north and would stay cold and wet. She noted where the creek narrowed and where it spread, and what the vegetation on the banks told her about the moisture levels in the soil below. Every evening, she came back to the kitchen table and transferred her notes onto graph paper. She drew the 40 acres by hand section by section, marking what she had found at each sample point: the limestone outcroppings, the clay deposits, the erosion channels, the places where something even in this neglected state was trying to grow. By the end of the week, she had a map that no soil survey had ever made. Not the county's version, which told you what the ground had been classified as decades ago. Her version. What the ground actually was right now in March of 1981, after everything that had been done to it. Then she went to the feed store and bought clover seed, red clover, 15 pounds per acre. And she bought a canvas seed bag that hung from her shoulder on a broad strap. Dale Renfrew drove past on a Tuesday afternoon in early April. He was heading west in his pickup, the new Silverado with the dealership logo on the door, and he slowed down when he passed the fence along Clara's 40. He could see her on the hillside. She was walking slowly, one hand dipping into the canvas bag, casting seed in long arcs across the rocky ground. No tractor, no drill, no equipment of any kind. Just a woman in worn work boots walking a slope that nobody had planted in years, seeding it by hand the way farmers had done a century before any of the machinery existed. Dale watched for a moment. Then he drove on. That evening at the corner cafe on Main Street, he told the story to the men gathered for coffee. Clara Voss was out there on her dead ground, he said, casting clover seed by hand like it was 1910. The ground wouldn't grow clover any better than it had grown corn. He was certain of that. The men at the counter agreed with him, and the laughter was easy and warm and sure of itself. None of them asked what kind of clover she was planting. None of them asked why. The why was this. Claire had spent 3 weeks before the auction reading everything she could find about soil biology, books from the county library, back issues of farm journals. One dense academic paper she had tracked down through the Extension Service that discussed the relationship between legumes and nitrogen fixation. She was not a soil scientist. She had a high school education and 30 years of practical farming experience, and a father who had believed, without ever using the academic language for it, that the health of the soil was the foundation of everything else. Red clover is a legume. Legumes do something that corn and soybeans cannot. Through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil, bacteria called rhizobium that colonize the root system, they pull nitrogen gas directly from the atmosphere and convert it into a form that plants can use. A good stand of red clover can fix 80 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. That is the equivalent of $40 to $75 worth of commercial fertilizer produced for nothing by the biology of the plant itself. But nitrogen fixation was only part of it. The root systems of red clover go deeper than corn roots, deeper than wheat, deeper than most of what gets planted on Iowa farmland. On ground like Clara's 40, where the upper layer was compacted clay and the subsoil was worse, those roots would work like slow drills. They would force their way down through the clay, creating channels thin at first, then wider as the roots grew and died and were replaced by new ones. Those channels would allow water to penetrate instead of running off. They would allow air into soil that had been sealed tight for decades. And when the clover died back each winter, the decaying roots would feed the soil. Biology, the bacteria, the protozoa, the microscopic fungi that had been slowly dying in ground that had nothing to live on. Earthworms would come. They always follow the biology. And earthworms are engineers. They move through soil and leave behind passages and castings that improve structure in ways that no tillage equipment can replicate. Clara knew enough of this to know that it would work, not immediately, not in a season, but over time and with patience and with the understanding that she was not trying to farm the ground the way everyone else had always farmed it. She was trying to give it back what it had lost. She seeded the flatter areas with a mix of red clover and timothy grass. On the steeper slopes, she used sweet clover and brome varieties that would hold the soil against erosion while the root systems got established. Along the lowest wet ground near the creek, she planted reed canary grass to stabilize the banks and stop the bleeding of topsoil into the water. She did all of this alone on foot over the course of 10 days. No hired help, no equipment beyond the seed bag and her boots and the notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Arlo Stills, the county extension agent, the man who had named the ground dead 20 years before any of this happened, heard what she was doing and felt something he didn't quite have a word for. It wasn't admiration, not yet. It was closer to curiosity, which was unusual for him because Arlo Stills had been the extension agent in Harlan County for 17 years and believed he had seen most of what Iowa farming could produce. He made a note in the file he kept on her property. Just 3 words written in the margin. Worth watching. Unusual. He did not drive out to the property. Not yet. He told himself there was nothing worth seeing yet, which was true. All that was visible from the road was a woman in muddy boots walking a hillside with a canvas bag. You would not have known looking at it that anything significant was happening. But something significant was happening. Not to the ground yet. The ground would take time. What was happening was this in a county where every farm decision made in the past decade had been shaped by the logic of debt, borrow more, plant, more, buy more, grow more. Clara Voss had made a decision from an entirely different logic. The logic of patience, the logic of biology over chemistry, the logic of a man who had kept a Farmall M running with homemade parts because he understood that reliability over time was worth more than speed in the short term. She had paid $7,400 for ground that everyone agreed was worthless. She had spent $14.50 on clover seed. She had a notebook full of soil sample data and a hand-drawn map on graph paper and a father's soil probe worn smooth with 30 years of use. And she had something else. She had time. Not the desperate borrowed time of a man paying 18% interest on a loan he could no longer service. Real time. Unencumbered time. The kind of time you can only have when you don't owe anyone anything. Dale Renfrew had a showroom full of green iron and 30 years of confident certainty and a watch that caught the light when he moved his hand. Clara Voss had a canvas seed bag and a notebook and 40 acres of ground that nobody else wanted. The spring of 1981 was cold and dry, and the clover came up slowly. But it came up. The clover did not announce itself. It came up the way most important things do, quietly without ceremony, in the margins of a season when everyone was looking somewhere else. By June of 1981, the flatter sections of Clara's 40 acres had a thin green cover that you could see from the road if you knew to look for it. Most people didn't look. There was too much else to watch that summer. The interest rate news came in waves, each one worse than the last. Farmers who had borrowed at 9% were now sitting across desks from loan officers who were explaining in the careful language banks use when they are about to deliver bad news that their operating lines were renewing at 18. The math that had seemed workable 2 years ago no longer worked at all. It had never really worked. It had just been obscured by rising land values and the optimism that rising land values produce in people who have borrowed against them. Clara watched all of it from her kitchen table and from the seat of the Farmall M and from the fence line of her dead ground where the clover was slowly, quietly doing what clover does. She did not talk much about what she was doing. That was not unusual for Clara. She had never been a woman who explained herself in advance of results. But there was something particular about the silence she kept that summer. It was the silence of a person who understands that the work is not yet visible and that trying to describe invisible work to skeptical people is a waste of time that could be spent doing the work. In August, she struck a deal with Lloyd Patton. Lloyd ran a dairy operation 3 miles down the road, 80 cows, a milking barn that smelled of hay and ammonia, and a manure problem that had been accumulating in a lagoon behind the barn for 2 years without a good solution. Clara knocked on his door on a Tuesday evening, hat in hand, and asked if she could have it. Not buy it, have it. She would haul it herself. Lloyd looked at her for a long moment. He was a practical man who did not waste time on suspicion when pragmatism was available. He said yes. She hauled 15 loads over 2 weeks using the Farmall M and a borrowed spreader. Spread it thin, about 8 tons to the acre on the flatter ground, less on the slopes where erosion was still a concern. The manure was not a glamorous input. It smelled in the August heat, and it drew flies, and the neighbors who drove past on the gravel road did not stop to ask what she was doing. But what it contained was irreplaceable nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and billions of microbial organisms that would seed the soil biology she was trying to rebuild. Commercial fertilizer could deliver the first 3. Nothing you could buy from a dealer could deliver the last one. The clover fed on the manure. The manure fed the clover, and underneath both of them, the soil began slowly, invisibly to change. Arlo Stills drove out in September. He had been meaning to come since the spring and had kept finding reasons not to. Partly he was busy, partly he was not sure what he expected to see. He parked his truck on the gravel shoulder and walked the fence line for 20 minutes without saying much. The clover on the flat ground was thick enough now that it had started crowding out some of the weeds. The slopes were holding. The creek bank, which had been bare mud the last time he had looked at it, had a fringe of canary grass along the edge. He took his own soil samples from 3 locations. He did not tell Clara what he found when he ran them back at the office. He just made another note in her file, biology responding faster than expected. What he didn't write, because it wasn't the kind of thing that went into an extension office file, was what he had actually felt standing in that field. Something close to surprise. He had called this ground dead for 20 years. He had meant it. And here it was, showing him something he hadn't anticipated. Not productivity, yet not anything you could measure against the county average, but movement. Life moving back into ground that had given up on life. He did not call it dead in his notes anymore. He didn't call it anything. He just wrote down the numbers. The winter of 1981 into 1982 was hard in ways that went beyond weather. The foreclosure notices started arriving in January, quiet envelopes from institutions with long official names that farmers had trusted for decades. The Farmers' Home Administration, the Federal Land Bank, the Production Credit Association. The notices used careful language acceleration of terms demand for payment in full, but the meaning was plain. You borrowed more than this land can now support. We want our money. The options are voluntary liquidation or involuntary. Choose. In Harlan County, 14 farms changed hands between January and June of 1982, not in auctions with bidding and competition. In the quiet, terrible way that foreclosed farms transfer machinery, lined up in a field, strangers walking through a house, a family loading what they could into a truck, and driving away from ground their parents had worked. Dale Renfrew sold 7 new tractors in 1982. He had sold 32 in 1979. 3 of the 7 were not technically sales. They were repossessions that he had been forced to take back from farmers who could no longer make their payments, cleaned up and repriced and moved back onto the floor. He stood in the showroom on slow afternoons and looked at the machines lined up under the fluorescent lights and tried to remember the feeling of 1979. The certainty of it, the warmth. He could remember it, but he couldn't get back inside it. Something had shifted, not just the market, something in the logic of the whole thing that he had never questioned before was now quietly demanding to be questioned, and he was not yet ready to answer. Clara planted oats in the spring of 1984. Not the whole 40, just the 25 flattest acres where 3 years of clover and manure had done enough work to make a grain crop viable. She planted them with a nurse crop of red clover seeded in underneath an old method her father had used, where the oats provided a canopy for the clover seedlings to establish under before the oats were harvested. 2 crops working together, the oats visible and harvestable, the clover invisible and permanent, fixing nitrogen for the season ahead. The oats came in at 62 bushels to the acre. It was not a number that would have turned heads at the elevator in a good year. But this was not a good year, and the number that mattered was not the yield. It was the piatikanan. Clara had bought no commercial fertilizer, no herbicides. Her operating cost for those 25 acres was essentially the price of diesel for the Farmall M and the seed itself. Less than $400 total. She sold the oats at the elevator for $1.85 a bushel. The arithmetic was modest, just under $3,000 in revenue from 25 acres, but the arithmetic was not the point. The point was that the ground had produced a crop without purchased inputs on soil that 3 years earlier had been classified as permanently non-productive. And the clover underneath was already thickening again, already fixing nitrogen for the next season, already doing it for free, what a fertilizer dealer would have charged her to do with a tank truck and a pump. Arlo Stills came out again that fall. This time he brought a camera. He photographed the soil samples, the root systems, the cross-section of topsoil depth on the flat ground. 3 years earlier, the topsoil had been 3 inches deep on the better spots. Now it was 5.5. He stood next to Clara at the edge of the oat field and measured the depth himself, pressing a steel rule into the ground until the texture changed from dark to pale. 5.5 inches. 2.5 inches of new topsoil in 3 years, built not by any machine or chemical, but by biology, by the roots and the worms and the microorganisms that the clover had invited back into ground they had abandoned. He looked up at Clara. He used her first name for the first time. Clara, he said, I have been the extension agent in this county for 17 years. I have never seen soil recover at this rate. She nodded. She looked at the ground and nodded him when she answered. It was never dead, she said. It was just tired. He wrote that down in his notebook. Later back at his office, he pulled out the soil map and looked at the white patch in the northwest corner for a long time. In the fall of 1983, Clara drove to Independence for a meeting at the county extension office. She had seen the notice posted at the feed store a soil scientist from Iowa State University would be presenting on something called no-till farming. The idea was not entirely new to her. She had read about it in one of the journals she ordered through the library, a method of planting that abandoned tillage altogether and allowed the soil structure to remain undisturbed, letting the biology do the work that plows had always been credited with doing. The concept made sense to her in the same way that the clover had made sense not as a rejection of effort, but as a redirection of it. Stop fighting the soil. Work with what it wants to do. The presenter was Dr. Everett Brannick, a soil scientist with a quiet manner and the habit of pausing before answering questions, as though he wanted to be sure the question had finished before he began. He spoke for 90 minutes about the biology of undisturbed soil, about the fungal networks that form between plant roots when the ground was not plowed, about water infiltration rates and aggregate stability and the compounding effect of biological activity over time. He used words that Clara did not always know, but whose meaning she could infer from context and from what she had seen with her own eyes on her 40 acres. When the meeting ended, the other farmers gathered their coats and filed out, talking among themselves. Clara waited until the room was nearly empty. Then she walked to the front and introduced herself. She opened her notebook on the table in front of Dr. Brannick. 3 years of soil data, sample locations marked on her hand-drawn map, organic matter readings taken at the same 47 points each fall, so the trend was clear. pH changes. Earthworm counts, she had started measuring those herself the previous spring. Counting worms in a cubic foot of soil dug to 12 inches of methods she had read about in a soil biology paper from the university extension. The numbers told a story that the county soil survey did not know how to tell. Dr. Brannick looked at the notebook for a long time. He turned pages. He went back to the beginning and read through it again. Clara stood across the table from him and waited. Finally, he looked up. How many acres, he asked. 40, she said. What did you pay? $185 an acre. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that Clara turned over in her mind for the rest of that drive home and many times after. Everyone in this county bought the best ground they could afford and then mined it until it was average. You bought the worst ground in the county and you are building it into something better. In 10 years, your 40 acres will outperform their 400. Clara did not write that down. She didn't need to. She thanked him and gathered her notebook and drove home on the gravel roads in the dark, the Farmall M. Waiting in the barn, the 40 acres waiting in the dark on the other side of the fence, the clover underneath the October stubble, already preparing for another season of quiet, relentless work. She did not tell anyone about that conversation. Not Lloyd Patton, not Arlo Stills, not Denton, who called occasionally from Des Moines to check in, and occasionally to remind her with the particular confidence of someone who had left that farming was a hard life and she didn't need to make it harder. She just drove home and went to sleep and got up the next morning and went back to work. In 1985, Congress passed the Food Security Act. Buried inside it was a provision called the Conservation Reserve Program. The CRP would pay farmers $50 an acre per year to take highly erodible land out of crop production, to plant it to grass or cover crops and leave it alone. The intention was to reduce overproduction and protect topsoil, two problems that the boom years had created and the bust years had made impossible to ignore any longer. Clara read about it in the farm section of the newspaper and sat with it for a while. $50 an acre, per year, for doing what she had been doing since 1981, not farming the steep ground, covering the slopes with grass, protecting the creek banks from erosion. The government was now proposing to pay farmers for the choice she had made voluntarily 4 years earlier, without any payment, without any program, because it was the right thing to do with that particular ground. She didn't apply for the CRP. Her 40 acres had moved past the point where taking it out of production made sense. The ground was producing now. It was going to keep producing. Taking a government payment to stop would have been like accepting money to stop breathing. But the irony was not lost on her. The system that had spent a decade encouraging farmers to borrow and expand and extract was now paying them to do what a woman alone with a canvas seed bag had figured out before anyone wrote it into law. That same year, Dale Renfrew closed his dealership. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way most things end, gradually, then suddenly. The loan portfolio at the regional banks had tightened so completely that new equipment financing was nearly impossible for most of his customers. The farmers who were still operating were patching their existing machines instead of replacing them. Dale had started taking in used equipment, older tractors, older planters, things he would have laughed at selling in 1979 just to keep the cash moving. He had let 2 of his 4 employees go in 1983. He let the third go in 1984. By the spring of 1985, it was just Dale and one part-time mechanic in a building that had been designed for a staff of 6 and an inventory that no longer existed. He locked the front door on a Thursday in April. He took the John Deere sign down from the front of the building himself, standing on a ladder in the parking lot in a light rain. The sign had been there since 1962. It was heavier than he remembered. He took it while selling insurance in Waterloo. Some people said he was lucky. He had gotten out with his house, which was more than some of his former customers could say. A man who had bought a farm on Dale's financing in 1979 and lost it in a foreclosure in 1983 had nothing to show for those 4 years except debt and a moving truck. At least Dale had his house. He drove past Clara's 40 on his way out of town the day he moved his things to Waterloo. He did not stop. He looked out the window as he passed the fence line and saw the thick grass on the slopes and the dark soil on the flat ground and the cattle she had put a few head out on the grass that spring, and then he looked back at the road and kept driving. There are things a person understands only after the fact, when the evidence has accumulated beyond the point where it can be argued with. Dale Renfrew was beginning to understand several things about the past 5 years that he had not understood while they were happening. He was not ready yet to say what those things were out loud. But the knowledge was there, building quietly in the way that soil builds layer by layer without announcement. Clara planted her first corn on the 40 acres in the spring of 1985. Not all of it, just 8 acres, the flattest, best recovered ground, where 5 years of clover and manure and biology had done enough work to make a corn crop something other than an act of wishful thinking. She planted it no-till using a planter she had modified herself in her father's workshop over the previous winter. She added coulters to cut through the clover residue without burying it, and she adjusted the row cleaners to move the surface trash to the side without disturbing the soil beneath. She bought no fertilizer. She applied no herbicides. She planted the corn directly into the killed clover sod, trusting 5 years of biological accumulation to supply what the crop needed. The county watched. They watched with different things, some with genuine curiosity, because enough time had passed now that Clara's stubbornness had started to look less like eccentricity and more like method. Some with the residual skepticism of people who had been right before and saw no reason to change their assessment. A few with something quieter, something that resembled hope, though they would not have used that word because hope was a complicated thing to hold in 1985 when so many of the people you knew had lost what they had hoped to keep. The corn came up in uneven rows. The no-till stand was thinner than a conventionally planted field. There were gaps where the residue had been heavy. It did not look in June like a field that was going to produce anything worth talking about. But Clara was not watching the rows. She was watching the roots. And in August, when the heat arrived, the kind of flat, heavy heat that settles over Iowa in drought years and bakes the clay soils into something close to ceramic, the difference became visible to anyone who cared to look. Corn stresses in drought by rolling its leaves. It is a survival mechanism. The plant reduces its surface area to limit moisture loss. A field full of rolled corn is a field in distress. You can see it from the road. By mid-August in 1985, most of the cornfields in Harlan County were showing rolled leaves by noon. Clara's 8 acres were not. The soil under the clover residue was 15 degrees cooler than the bare cultivated ground in the fields around it. The organic matter now at 2.4% on the flat ground, nearly double what it had been in 1981, was holding moisture the way a sponge holds water, releasing it slowly into the root zone instead of losing it to evaporation. The mycorrhizal fungi that had reestablished in the undisturbed soil were extending the root system's effective reach, pulling moisture and phosphorus from depths that conventionally planted corn could not access. The biology was working, and in August of 1985, you could see it from the road. Green and upright in a county of brown and curled. The yield that fall was 134 bushels to the acre. The county average on ground that had been farmed with full commercial inputs, fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, was 128. Clara Voss had outproduced the county average on dead ground, without a dollar spent on purchased fertility, in a drought year. Arlo Stills picked up the phone that evening and called the agronomy department at Iowa State University. "You need to send someone out here," he said. "Something is happening on a 40-acre parcel in Harlan County that you need to see." The graduate student Iowa State sent was named Gareth Solon. He arrived in June of 1988 in a pickup truck with a university plate and a bed full of equipment: soil corers, moisture meters, infiltration, ring sample bags, a field notebook that was already half full of methodology notes, written in a hand so small it looked like it had been printed. He was 26 years old, serious in the way that young scientists are serious when they have not yet been surprised enough times to develop humility, and he had been briefed by Dr. Everett Brannock before leaving Ames. Brannock had told him what to expect in technical terms. Degraded Class 6 soil partially restored through biological methods over 7 years, no commercial inputs, no till conversion, beginning in year 5. Yield data showing above county average production. Soil organic matter trending upward. What Brannock had not been able to prepare him for was the actual experience of standing on that ground. Gareth Solon spent his first morning walking the 40 acres before he ran a single test. He walked it the way Clara had walked it in March of 1981, slowly paying attention, stopping often. The slopes that had been bare and eroding when Clara bought the property were covered now in thick grass that muffled the sound of his boots. The creek bank, which Arlo Stills remembered as bare mud, that bled into the water after every rain, was held in place by a dense root system that had knitted itself into the soil over 7 years until the bank and the grass had become a single thing. The water running in the creek was clear. He stood at the edge and looked downstream for a long time. Clear water in an Iowa agricultural creek in 1988 was not something a soil scientist encountered without stopping to note it. He spent the rest of June and all of July collecting data. He took soil samples from a grid of points across the property, running them through the university's lab protocols for organic matter, aggregate stability, bulk density, pH, and microbial activity. He measured water infiltration rates using double-ring infiltrometers pressed into the soil at 12 locations: flat ground, mid-slope, upper slope, creek margin. He counted earthworms in cubic foot samples dug to 12 inches, a method he recognized from the literature and had not expected to actually use in the field because most agricultural soils in Iowa did not produce earthworm counts worth counting. Clara's 40 acres produced earthworm counts worth counting. 22 worms per cubic foot averaged across the sample locations. The county average on Class 1 soil, the best ground in Harlan County, the dark shaded acres that had sold at $3,200 in 1981, was 18. He ran the number twice because he didn't trust it the first time. Then he ran it a third time with a fresh sample from a different location. The number held. Dead ground was producing more earthworms per cubic foot than the best farmland in the county. He wrote it in his notebook in capital letters and underlined it, and sat in the grass next to the sample hole for a few minutes before he wrote anything else. The water infiltration results were similar in their implications. On conventionally tilled ground in Harlan County, rainfall moved into the soil at an average rate that left significant runoff during heavy rain events, the kind of runoff that carried topsoil into ditches and streams and eventually into the river system. On Clara's 40 acres, the infiltration rate had increased by 340% compared to the baseline measurements Arlo Stills had taken in 1981. Rainfall that would have run off a conventional field was absorbed, held, stored in the soil structure that 7 years of biological activity had built. The aggregate stability, the measure of how well soil particles hold together under the impact of rain and the pressure of roots, had moved from poor to good. The organic matter on the flat ground and had risen from 1.2% in 1981 to 3.8% in 1988. In 7 years, without a single bag of purchased fertilizer. Gareth Solon wrote his master's thesis that winter. He titled it Biological Restoration of Degraded Cropland in Northeast Iowa, a 7-year case study. It was a careful, methodical document that laid out what he had found without embellishment. The numbers were enough. The thesis would be cited in 12 subsequent academic papers on soil health and regenerative agriculture, read by researchers at universities in 4 countries, and eventually referenced in a USDA report on sustainable agricultural practices that was distributed to extension offices across the Midwest. Clara never read it. She was too busy farming. In 1988, she planted 30 of the 40 acres to corn, not the 8 acres she had started with in 1985. 30 acres because the ground had now recovered enough across most of the property that 30 acres made agronomic sense. The yield that fall was 148 bushels to the acre. The county average was 131. Her cost per bushel was approximately 85 cents. The county average cost per bushel, accounting for fertilizer, herbicide, fuel equipment, depreciation, and interest on operating loans, was just over $2. She was producing more corn at less than half the cost, on ground that had been legally classified as non-productive cropland when she bought it. Her net profit per acre was nearly 3 times the county average. And her land, the 40 acres she had paid $185 for in 1981, was now appraising at $1,400 per acre. Her original investment of $7,400 was worth $56,000, a 657% return in 7 years. No debt, no interest payments, no risk of foreclosure, no loan officer's letter to dread in the morning mail. The numbers were real, but numbers by themselves do not capture what had actually happened on those 40 acres. They tell you the outcome without telling you the nature of the thing. What had actually happened was something older and simpler than any of the data Gareth Solon had collected, something that the soil surveys and yield monitors and infiltration meters could point toward but not fully describe. What had happened was that Clara Voss had listened to the ground. Not metaphorically, not in the romantic sense that agricultural writers sometimes use when they want to make farming sound like a spiritual practice. Literally. She had paid attention to what the ground was telling her about what it needed, and she had provided that rather than what the market or the extension bulletins or the equipment dealers said it should have. She had treated the soil as a living system rather than an inert medium for applying purchased inputs to, and the living system had responded the way living systems respond to care: slowly, quietly, and then with a force that surprised everyone who had not been paying attention. Arlo Stills paid attention. He came out to the 40 acres 4 more times between 1985 and 1988, each visit longer than the last, each set of notes in his file more detailed. He had been the county extension agent for 24 years by the fall of 1988, and in that time he had seen a great deal of Iowa farmland in a great many conditions. He had seen good ground farmed well and good ground farmed poorly. He had seen marginal ground pushed beyond its limits by men who needed yields they couldn't sustainably produce. He had written thousands of soil recommendations and crop plans and fertilizer schedules, all of them built on the assumption that the job of the farmer was to impose productivity on the land through the application of sufficient inputs. He was not sure he believed that anymore. Standing on Clara's 40 in October of 1988, the corn harvested and the ground going into winter covered the soil dark and loose under his boots in a way that Class 6 soil was never supposed to feel. The reckoning came on a Saturday morning in October of 1988 at the Harlan County Livestock Auction Barn on the south edge of town. Clara was there to sell calves, 8 head from the cattle she had been running on the grass sections of the 40 acres of animals that had grazed rotationally through the summer, moved every few days to prevent overgrazing. Their weight gains steady, and their condition better than you typically saw in a dry year. She was standing at the fence beside the sale ring, watching the auctioneer work through the earlier lots when she heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She knew who it was before she turned around. She had seen Dale Renfrew across the barn when she arrived, standing near the entrance, in a suit that was well-pressed but less expensive than the ones she remembered from the years when his showroom had been the most prosperous-looking building on the highway west of town. He was working for an insurance company out of Waterloo. She had heard that much from Lloyd Patton, who heard most things eventually. Dale walked up and stood beside her at the fence. He didn't say anything immediately. He watched two lots of feeder calves move through the ring, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling, the buyer's hands making small signals that only the ringman could reliably read. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight. Then he spoke. "Clara," he said, "I drove past your 40 the other day." She didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the ring. "Looks different," he said. "It is different," she said. "How's the corn doing 148 this year?" Another silence. A lot of calves moved through the ring. The auctioneer called numbers with the practiced rhythm of a man who had done this for decades. Dale looked down at the gravel for a moment. Then he looked back at the ring. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, and carrying something that had not been in it the last time they had really spoken in that feed store in 1981, with the laughter still in the room. "I sold close to 200 tractors in this county," he said. "Big ones, expensive ones. I told every one of those farmers they needed more horsepower, more acres, more iron. I told them the world needs to eat, and they were the ones feeding it, and there was no ceiling on how far they could go if they were willing to borrow enough to get there." He paused. "Most of them are gone now. Lost their farms, lost their equipment. Some of them lost a good deal more than that." He stopped. The auctioneer called a number. A hand went up across the ring. "You bought the worst 40 acres in this county," Dale said. "You paid Q. You planted clover on it. And you are still here." Clara did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the cattle moving through the ring, on the auctioneer's steady calling voice, on the familiar choreography of a livestock sale that she had attended every fall since she was old enough to ride along with her father. "The ground was never the problem, Dale," she said. "The debt was." He nodded once slowly, the way a person nods when they have heard something they already knew but had not yet found the words for. Then he excused himself quietly and walked back toward the entrance of the barn, and Clara watched her calves go through the ring and received a fair price for them and drove home on the gravel roads in the October afternoon, with the windows down and the fields going brown on either side of the road. She did not feel vindicated. She was not built for vindication, which requires a certain amount of scorekeeping that her nature did not incline toward. What she felt was something simpler. The particular quiet of a person who has done what they set out to do and can now see clearly in the rearview mirror of time that the doing of it was the point. The years after 1988 were years of refinement rather than discovery. Clara had found what worked on her 40 acres, and she deepened it. She extended the rotational grazing system across all of the grass sections, increasing the number of paddocks and shortening the grazing intervals until the grass recovery between grazings was consistently strong. She began integrating winter cover crops into the corn rotation, cereal rye planted after the fall harvest, growing through the winter, terminated in spring, and planted into no-till. The cover crops added another layer of biological activity, another season of root growth and organic matter contribution, another mechanism for holding the soil in place through the freeze and thaw cycles of Iowa winters. She bought no new equipment. When the Farmall M finally gave out in 1994, 16,000 hours on the meter, which was 11,000 more than the dealer who originally sold it to her father would have considered possible. She replaced it with a used Farmall. 5.60 she found at an estate auction 2 counties over. $800 cash. She brought it home and spent a week in the workshop going through it the way her father had taught her to go through a used machine, systematically from the front axle to the PT. Replacing what needed replacing, cleaning what could be cleaned, making a list of what she would need to watch. It ran well for 20 years. The farm did not make her rich. She had never been trying to make it make her rich. The numbers were good consistently, profitable, consistently improving, but they were the numbers of a small operation run without debt, not the numbers of a large one run with leverage. The 40 acres was never going to produce the kind of income that would make the financial pages. It was going to produce enough consistently, sustainably, year after year on ground that everyone had agreed was incapable of producing anything at all. Enough was sufficient. Enough was in the accounting of the 1980s farm crisis an extraordinary achievement. 300,000 farms had disappeared from the American landscape in that decade. The farmsteads still stood on much of that ground, empty houses, rusting equipment, fields worked now by neighbors who had bought the foreclosed acres at auction and folded them into operations that were themselves often too large and too leveraged. The consolidation of American agriculture that began in the 1980s would continue for decades, each crisis accelerating the process by which small farms became large farms and large farms became corporations. And the people who had once lived on that ground moved to towns and cities and tried to find other work. Clara stayed. That was the fact that the numbers could not fully represent. While the structure of American agriculture reorganized itself around her, while the neighbors who had borrowed and expanded in the 70s lost their ground one by one, and the town of Harlan lost businesses, and the county lost population, and the rural fabric that had held for a century became something different and thinner and harder to see clearly, Clara Voss stayed. On her 200 acres, on her 40 acres of dead ground, farming the way her father had taught her to farm, which was to say farming as though the ground mattered more than the season's price, as though what you gave to the soil was as important as what you took from it, as though the work of a farmer was not extraction, but stewardship. She retired in 2015. She was 78 years old and the Farmall 560 still ran, and the 40 acres she had bought for $185 an acre in 1981 had organic matter levels above 5% equal to virgin prairie soil, the kind of soil that had existed across Iowa before the breaking plow ever touched it. Ground that had never been broken by settlement, never depleted by a century of extraction. That was what 5% organic matter meant. She had taken dead ground and returned it to something older than farming. Arlo Stills had retired in 1998. On his last day in the extension office, he did what he had been thinking about doing for years. He went to the wall behind his desk and lifted down the soil map that had hung there since before Clara Voss had bought those 40 acres, since before the farm crisis, since before any of the things that had happened in Harlan County in the years that map had silently witnessed. He laid it on his desk and looked at the white patch in the northwest corner, the 40 acres he had named dead ground. The 40 acres that had taught him something late in his career that all his years of training had not. He took a black marker from the cup on his desk. He colored in the white patch. He pressed the marker down and moved it deliberately across the shape of the 40 acres until the white was entirely covered, until it was as dark on the map as the best ground in the county, as dark as the Class 1 prairie loam that had always been shaded to show how rich it was. He made Clara's 40 as dark as any of it. Darker, maybe. The marker was generous, and his hand was certain. Then he wrote 2 words underneath the patch in the small, careful handwriting he had used for 30 years of field notes, and soil reports and extension bulletins, and the quiet documentation of a farming county living through a defining generation. He wrote Clara's ground. He set the map on top of the filing cabinet where someone would find it. He put on his coat and turned off the light and walked out of the extension office for the last time down the steps and across the parking lot and into a retirement he had been looking forward to, and also quietly dreading the way anyone dreads the end of work that has mattered to them. But he did not feel the dread that afternoon. He felt something else, the particular satisfaction of a man who had been wrong about something important and had lived long enough to see the correction to hold it in his hands or to mark it on the map in permanent ink. Dead ground, 40 acres of limestone and clay and exhausted soil, and a century of failed expectations. 40 acres that a woman with a canvas seed bag and a father's soil probe and $47,000 in a savings account had decided to listen to instead of fight. The ground was never dead. She had said that to Arlo Stills in the fall of 1984, standing in a field that was just beginning to show him it was true. It was never dead. It was just tired. It needed someone willing to give it a team in biology and patience, and the one input that no dealer had ever found a way to sell the refusal to take more than the ground could give. Clara Voss gave it that, and the ground gave back.